So the title of my talk is Low Context DevOps, a new way of improving S3 team culture, or DevOps culture. So a little about myself. I'm the manager of the S3 teams at stackoverflow.com. I've been a sysadmin for many years, and I've written a number of books. And if you believe the back cover of those books, I'm an internationally recognized DevOps pundit, which I guess it means I've been on video conferences like this that go all around the world. How many people, at this point in the talk, I usually ask the audience, how many people have heard of Stack Overflow? And the whole audience raises their hand. It's a little difficult to do this over video conference, but I'm just gonna assume that you've all heard of Stack Overflow. We have 100 million users. Demographers tell me that there are 30 million developers in the world, which means for every developer you meet, 6 or 7 more people actually use our website. I'm going to mention Stack Overflow for Teams later. And this would, in pre-COVID days, this is when I would ask the audience, have you heard of Stack Overflow Teams? A lot fewer people in the audience raise their hands. And well, maybe we'll talk more about that in a bit. So this talk has 3 parts. We're going to talk about high and low context cultures. We're going to talk about a new concept that a phrase I coined called low context DevOps. We're going to end by talking a little about leadership. So high and low context cultures. So there's a man traveling in a foreign land, and he enters a village and goes into one of the shops, and the shopkeeper won't talk to him. He thinks that's weird. So he goes to the next shop, and they won't talk to him either. And he's very confused. Did I do something wrong? What's going on here? So he goes outside and he sits at the side of the road, and he's pondering this. And a little boy comes up to him and he says, "Mister, when you come to this village, first you have to go to the elders, and they will give you their blessing, and then people will talk to you." And he's like, "Really? Oh my God. Okay." So he does that, and the rest of the day, everything works fine. Everyone will talk to him. Well, later that night, he's sitting in his room, and he's thinking, how the heck was I supposed to know that? Well, simultaneously, that little boy was sitting in his room thinking, how could that guy not know that? Okay, story number 2. My first week at Stack Overflow. I'm going through, my mentor is training me on some things, and we're doing a basic thing. We're installing a new machine, and the process is very complicated. There's like 10 steps, and it's not written down anywhere. And I said, how do you expect someone to have known to do all these different things? And he said, well, we assume that anyone who gets through our interview process, would know these things. And I'm like, I'm feeling like that guy in that village, right? But here's the weird thing about this story. The next day, I get a call from my boss who says, hey, you didn't add that new machine to the inventory. Now, I could be world recognized system administrator, and how the heck would I have known that there's this inventory system that needs to be updated? And in fact, the person that was training me also forgot to do that. So that's story number 2. These are examples of high context cultures. High context cultures is a culture where communication is implicit. Not too much is written down. It's more like a collective history. Like people know things because they know things, right? They've been around for long enough to experience, and they pick things up along the way. Maybe there's a lot of reading between the lines in the conversation. In a high context culture, well, high context cultures generally work best for very long relationships because you have the time to develop this collective knowledge. Compare that to a low contrast culture. Low context culture is where communication is explicit. There are rules, and those rules are written down, and you have access to read them. So knowledge tends to be codified. It's written down, it's public, it's external, and it's accessible. And this works in environments where interpersonal connections are shorter durations. For example, at an airport, you're only going to be there a very short amount of time. So the signs are very clear. You're told, how to get to where you need to go to. There's a lot of signs. Similar on supermarkets and sporting events, etc. And the sociologists that study this concept of high and low context cultures have identified that certain languages actually, you could actually stack rank your languages on their context. So in a high context language, meaning is not always communicated in the language. There might be more reading between the lines. So one more story. This is Penn Station. It's a train station in New York City. I live in New Jersey, and pre-pandemic, I commuted to the Stack Overflow headquarters based in New York City, took the train in every day and passed through Penn Station. Penn Station is one of the most high context travel terminals I've ever been to. This is a map of Penn Station. This map is, it makes no sense. It only makes sense to someone who already knows Penn Station. And if you think about it, the only people that need the map are people that don't know Penn Station. The top and bottom halves are at different scales. They don't overlap very well, et cetera, et cetera. But this is my favorite high context example in Penn Station. It's this sign. If you notice, it says that the 7th Avenue subway is that way. It's over to the left. The 7th Avenue subway, 30 years ago, the name of the 7th Avenue subway was changed to the 123 line. So literally, for this sign to make sense, you either have to have been around for 30 years or you have read the Wikipedia page on the history of the New York subway station. That is super high context. And I bring this up not just because it's a funny example, but recently I was looking at the sign and I noticed, it's lit up. There's a light bulb behind it. Light bulbs don't last 30 years. Someone has been changing this light bulb for 30 years and they are not empowered to tell their boss, hey, we have a sign to be fixed, right? And isn't this like symbolic of big organizations, and especially in technical organizations? We have to stop changing the light bulb and fix the sign. Okay, so that's my little spiel about low and high context cultures. How can we apply this to DevOps? First of all, I'm going to make this assertion. I assert that a DevOps environment should strive to be low context. I mean, think about it. Which of these two descriptions would you want at the company you're working at? I assert that you want it to be low context. And I'm going to talk in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about 3 ways to reduce the required context of your DevOps environment. And those 3 ways are carefully constructed defaults, what I call making write easy, and ubiquitous documentation. So let's begin. Carefully constructed defaults. When you're a new employee at a company, you need a certain number of tools and things to be productive, right? You need a PC, you need the software required to do your job, and you need access and permission to the systems that enable you to do your job. And at a lot of companies, it can be weeks or months before a new employee can be productive because they don't have these things. I have friends that work at banks that say it's typical that they are at the company for 6 months before they can do their job. I had one friend who left a company after 1.5 years because she still did not have the necessary tools to do her job. And you would think like, wow, I'd be glad to be just paid to do nothing for a long time. But she's not that kind of person. She was very frustrated and she decided to leave. And why does this stay broken? Well, I have a couple theories. One is that if you're a new employee and you're feeling that pain, you can't fix it because you're the new employee. You don't have any power. And if you're an experienced employee, if you've been there for a while, you're not feeling the pain. So why the heck are you going to fix it? And even if you are interested in fixing it, this is hard. This is really hard to fix. It requires working across silos. I mean, think about, if there's a lot of these problems, you would have to work across IT and InfoSec and engineering and maybe even HR. And that's super difficult to coordinate between these different departments. But who will do it if you don't? Now, I gave this talk recently and someone said, Tom, I'm only a new employee once. Well, actually, nowadays, people are jumping from project to project. Typical projects often only last 6 months or a couple years. So if it takes you, so the sooner you can be up to speed, the more productive you're going to be on a project. Because we're always new employees. Like every time you change projects, you're a new employee. Okay. Gene Kim, who was mentioned in a previous talk, has a new book out called The Unicorn Project, and it really focuses on this issue. And I'm not going to go any more into detail because he does a great job in that book, but a highly recommended book. It just came out this year. Second thing we could do is we could make write easy. Make write easy means the lazy path should guide you to the right way. In other words, if you're trying to get your coworkers to follow a policy, it's more likely that they're going to follow the policy if it's the lazy thing to do, if you made it super easy, right? If all those defaults are there. So for example, let's talk about OpenSSL versus LibreSSL. OpenSSL is this software library that does encryption. So when you go to a website and it's HTTPS, the S stands for SSL or secure, and this is often the software behind, at the web server that's making that security happen. And if you've ever used OpenSSL, it is really difficult to use. In fact, one of the reasons why, there's a whole category of security problems on the internet because people have misconfigured OpenSSL, or developers using OpenSSL didn't set a parameter correctly or whatever, and you think things work, but they're not really secure. I assert it practically requires a PhD to get OpenSSL right. And even if you do get everything right, 6 months later, those settings are stale because technology changes. So there's a fork of OpenSSL called LibreSSL, and they said, what if we made the default to be just timelessly correct? We're going to have a super simple API. It's going to look like the Unix, open, read, write, close commands instead of, what the fine people at OpenSSL did. And not only is it the default is the correct thing, but it's timelessly correct. You don't have to fiddle with it every time there's a new encryption protocol or an old encryption protocol is cracked and is considered decommed. So we can do this in other places. Like, for example, where I work at Stack Overflow, our CI/CD pipeline embodies the recommended practices. We don't have to beg people to do certain things. We just trust that they're going to be lazy enough to go with the defaults, right? There's a company called Squarespace. I saw a talk from them recently. They had a big problem. They said, we're hiring tons of developers, and it's hard enough to hire a developer that is really good, but it's even harder to hire a developer that also, is good at coding and understands how to write code that is good and operational, has all that good, monitoring, telemetry collection, and all that stuff. So what they did is they put all those operational things in the base library, the library that all code gets linked to. And now they could take a developer off the street with no operational experience, and they can't not write a program that at least has the minimal standards of what they need to have their code be operable. So they made the lazy path is the good path. And we can embody this kind of philosophy in all of our foundational tools, from our ticket system to our bug tracking system, our source code control, configuration management. These are all opportunities to take that extra bit of time when you're setting it up, when you're configuring it for use in your company, and saying, okay, great, we've been working on this for a little while and we got it working, but that's not good enough. Let's work on it a little while and make it so that the lazy way is the right way. And let's update it over time, right? You know, new ideas come and go. You want to embody those new ideas over time. So those are the first two ways that I'm going to talk about. Now let's talk about number 3, ubiquitous documentation. And this is, as you can imagine, a larger conversation. So let's start with a little story. Another train station. This is Paddington Station in London. And if you've ever landed in Heathrow and then you take the train to get into London, you probably end up here. And I love this station. It's beautiful. There's a whole lot to love about it. But one of the things I really love is they understand ubiquitous documentation, because when you land there, or actually, I'll give an example. So the first time I landed there, I was you know, a little lost, and I needed to find the taxi stand, right? And I looked down at my feet, and there was these instructions. Oh, let me zoom in a little so you can all see them. It says taxis and an arrow. That is so brilliant. It is the right amount of documentation in the right location at the right time, right? I've gotten off the train and I was actually about to ask someone, excuse me, can you tell me how to find the taxi stand? And right before I opened my mouth, I just happened to look down and see it. And you know, it's the right amount of documentation too. It's just taxis and an arrow. It's not, you can find the taxis over here. It's not the Wikipedia history of taxis, right? Taxis over here. How can we, I wish all documentation in our systems could be this clear and concise. But fundamentally what we want to do is we want docs when you need them, where you need them. And it's so much easier now because now we can deep link, right? You should be able to deep link to the documentation. You know, before the web, you know, when I got started in system administration, you know, we didn't have URLs. Anyway, so where can we put these links? We could put them in error messages, right? Why have an error message that doesn't say, you know, most error messages say you're a bad person because this happened. How about an error message that says, this happened, here's how to fix it, here's the link, right? In our control panels, in our alert messages. Obviously, you know, it's 4 in the morning, you get paged. You don't want to just be told something's down. You want to link to the documentation that says how to fix it, right? Everywhere people might need information, have the link. Make it easy for people. You know who understands this really well? Apple. I don't know if you've upgraded, by now you've probably upgraded to Catalina. In Catalina, they changed the default terminal shell from Bash to Z shell. And if you're configured to still use the old shell, you get this message every time you open a terminal window. It tells you that they've made this change. The default interactive shell is now Z shell. Here's how to fix it. It doesn't explain why this command works or how it works or what the -s flag does. It just says type this and you're done. But if you need more information, here's the URL. Great example of ubiquitous documentation at the right time in the right place. So how can we create this culture of documentation that Tom is raving about? Well, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work, and it takes work from a lot of different people. Management needs to set expectations, right? Management should not consider a project done until it's documented. And not just for, you know, big projects. Everything needs documentation. I set a goal with my team. Every time they close a ticket, they should update the wiki page. And maybe 80% of the time, right? Even if that's to, you know, fix a comma, that's better than nothing. Even if the documentation says, you know, the command to use is XYZ, you could cut and paste. Well, this is the command I use this time. Here's an example, right? Or if maybe there's that example, you can clean that up a bit and make it more generic, right? There's always little ways of updating documentation. And if you just make that part of how you work, documentation will get updated. And will stay current. And that relates to the second thing. You need to have you need to inspire a culture of always updating the documentation as you work. You know, people say like, oh, this project will take 3 days plus a day to update the documentation. I don't allow that on my team anymore. That's a 4-day project. Documentation is not this thing at the end that you might do. It's not optional. It's a 4-day project. And I encourage people to be documenting as they go, right? You little, small batch documentation. Another thing your organization can do is treat documentation like software. You should have a bug category in your bug system you shouldn't have a separate bug category for documentation bugs. You should file bugs in documentation just like you would file a bug if the software crashed. And lastly, you need to develop really good answers to common excuses to not document. For example, I had someone tell me recently that his coworkers say, well, my code is the documentation. Okay, fine, but at the minimum, you need a doc that tells you where to find that code, right? So over time, you'll develop those responses. If you need more inspiration, another thing that inspires me to keep the documentation update is I document so that I can relax while I'm on vacation. How many times have you had a vacation that was ruined because either you were stressing out, like what if something goes wrong, or you actually did get called because of a problem? The more you document, the more you can relax while you're on vacation. Now, maybe you're thinking, Tom, documentation? What documentation? My company has no documentation, right? Documentation at my company is like a 404 error. Well, I think this is actually rather common. And I think it's because, a lot of engineers, they don't like to write documentation. If I said, raise your hand if you like to write documentation, I don't think a whole lot of people would be raising their hand. So let's talk about why people avoid writing documentation. I think these are the 3 big issues. Uncertain scope, it's really, you're sitting down, it feels like such a big project, right? Like, what's the scope? Should I document just the specific thing or everything about this thing? The audience is uncertain. Like, am I supposed to be writing this for my coworker who's also on call and I don't have to explain a lot of background, or do I have to write this, assuming that, they've just been hired and I have to explain every little thing? And the third thing, so the third thing needs a little explanation. Third thing is the scariest thing that a writer can see. It is so scary, I put it on a separate slide because I want to give this warning. If you have a weak heart or are pregnant, you might want to not, watch the next part of this talk. Parents, cover your children's eyes because this is the scariest thing that a writer can ever see, and that is the blank screen. The blank screen is terrifying to writers. Where do you start? Where do you start? I've written many books, and every single one of them was delayed by weeks because I was staring at a blank screen. Where do I start? Where do I start? Let me, just to cover all my bases, this is for you Vim users, this is a blank Vim document. I know there's a lot of Microsoft people in the audience, so blank Microsoft Word document. Notepad for some of you beginners, if you're cool and using Sublime. And of course, what could be cool, speaking of cool, what would be cooler than dark mode, blank screen? Anyway, blank screen syndrome, while not a recognized medical condition, is a very real problem. And how can we deal with this? Well, I think the simplest solution is to have some really awesome templates. On my team, we have 2 templates that get used most frequently. One is the service doc template. Every service we have has a little document that covers some basic information, and every alert in our monitoring system, we also use a template for the document that the alert links to. And the reason why templates work so well is it removes the blank page syndrome. It becomes more like you're just filling out a form than staring at this scary, scary blank page. The other thing you can do is write in small batches. Don't try to write a whole book. Try to write 1 sentence. Like I said before, if every time you close a ticket, if you can make 1 small change to the documentation, that's better. If as you're doing a project, you have another window open, so you're always updating the documentation, and then at the end, you just have to do some editing and cleanups, and you're done. right? Small batch documentation. And like I said before, include the documentation as part of the work update. Don't say this is a 3-day project with 1 day to update the documentation. That's a 4-day project. The last bit of advice I have is look for where your engineers are already writing and repurpose that, right? You know, someone sends you a great explanation in an email, reply and say, hey, that's a really great explanation. Would you please paste that into our documentation repo, right? And I do this for emails and chats and even instant messages. Have you ever gotten an instant message that's like a 5-page explanation of something? Yeah, don't leave that in chat. Capture that, repurpose that text somewhere that other people can use it. You know, another place that engineers like to write is Stack Overflow, where I work. I mean, our website is just, all the content is produced by, you know, by the viewers. It's, you know, it's not like I sit at work writing writing answers all day. And I have a theory that the reason Stack Overflow is so successful is because it solves these problems. The scope and audience problems that I mentioned before, those are solved. You know the scope. When the question is answered, you're done. You don't have to go any further because you're just, there's a question that defines the scope. There's a clear audience. You understand from the question is this a beginner question or an advanced question, and so that helps you identify the audience that you're writing to. And what I mentioned about templates before, Stack Overflow, you know, it's like filling out a form, and we now have this answer wizard that walks you through the process of answering a question. So I did say that I would mention Stack Overflow for Teams a bit. Stack Overflow for Teams gives you a private Stack Overflow experience just for your company, and it's secure. And I'm not here to make a big sales pitch, but if you think that this would help you reduce the context of your DevOps environment, check us out at stackoverflow.com/teams. It has some really nice enterprisey features. Particularly, you know, it's great for new employees. They can find, you know, history of documentation or history of things by reading the documentation. Experienced employees feel really good about being able to write things. I met a customer recently who, for years, he maintained the authentication library at his company, and no one ever talked to him about it except to complain and complain about bugs. And he set up a tag for the name of that library, and he just sits there watching the tag for questions. And he is so happy now because first of all, he's seeing how many people use his tool, and he's getting all these great questions and answering them. And it's become the way he's able to support this library and be better at his job and serve the company better. And, you know, it works for everyone because it's, you know, it's a simple user interface. So lastly, I want to talk about leadership. Who's going to make all of this happen, right? Now, what it takes to make these, I mean, I've talked about a lot of changes today, and the earlier talks also, a lot of this was how this is a new thing. How do you get the company to adopt these new practices? How do you make these changes? And the answer is, it takes leadership. It takes leadership to make these changes. Now, I know what a lot of you are saying, Tom, I don't want to be a manager. I like being an engineer. I don't want to be a manager. Well, there's a difference between being a leader and a manager. You know, management and leadership are very different. Management is an HR thing. It's something in the org chart, right? A manager is all about setting priorities, providing resources, and clearing roadblocks. That's my definition of manager. And leadership is very different. Leadership is something everyone can do. Leadership is about going first and making it easy for others to follow. So it's a lot like the children's game, Follow the Leader, right? The person at the head of the line, they're deciding the big picture, like, how are we gonna do this thing? But they're doing it first, and that makes it easy for others to follow. So whether you're deploying a new CI/CD system, you know, how you're going first, you're probably setting up that first project. How do you make it easy for others to follow? You're setting up good defaults. You're making it easy for the lazy person to do the right thing. You're creating templates in your documentation system. so that, maybe you're a senior person that can create the template, but everyone else can use it. You've reduced the context. You've made it easier for them to write those docs. So in summary, this talk is about making your DevOps environment low context. And it's not an on-off switch. It's a never-ending process. Lots of different ways to do it. We talked about smart defaults. We talked about making write easy. And we talked about ubiquitous documentation. And lastly, and then we talked about why people don't write docs. There's the burden of determining the audience and the scope and the scary blank screen syndrome. And how do we fix this? Templates, templates, templates. Repurpose text from where people are already writing and have a good central source. So that's my talk. And I just want to end by saying, stop changing the light bulb. Let's fix the sign. Thank you very much. And now I think we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much for that. It was a great talk. I'm just looking through the Q&A bit right now. We still haven't got any other. Oh no, we've just had something pop through. Can you see that at all? If the Q&A.
Let's see. I'm clicking on. Maybe I have to stop sharing.
Yeah, at the bottom. You should see the Q&A.
Let's see. No, I'm not seeing, because could you just read off?
So it's from Bruce Hartley. He says, I've worked in orgs that have been using Confluence for many years, so that now there are so many pages and so much documentation bloat, it becomes impossible to find information easily and manage it. How would you deal with the problem where there's almost too much context?
Good point. Yeah, so when you, there does come to be a point where you have a large corpus of documentation, and that's when it's good to have a librarian. And that librarian could be actually a person, or it could be an algorithm. So for example, there are some systems that show an icon or maybe color the background if a page is particularly old. Or you can do database queries and determine, which are the oldest pages, and maybe have a fix-it day where everyone volunteers to work on those docs. The other thing you can do is adopt a policy that if you see a document that you think is out of date, maybe there's some way to indicate it. Like maybe something simple, like you just put a note in the comment that says, I think this might be out of date. Please check before you use it. Another thing to do, something I do with my team, is once a year we have a 2-day event where we take the documentation related to our team. We list it all out, like in a spreadsheet or something, title and URL, and everyone volunteers to take a couple documents. And we just, it's like some companies do like a bug fix-it day. We do a documentation fix-it day. And you don't always have to fix a document. You could also delete document. Especially in operations, I find sometimes the best way to deal with an old document is to delete it, or at least mark at the top, this is obsolete. Excellent question. And by the way, now I can see the
You can see it now.
So.
Yeah, perfect. Well, yeah, that seems to be it really from Bruce. But I mean, I'll leave this open for about 5 minutes or so to allow anyone else to type in, any questions that may have. But listen, no, thank you very, very much for that. I appreciate it, and I'm sure the others did too.